And on the 8th day, God made the motorcycle, and he saw that it was good. But it needed to be more dirt-worthy, so in 1914, Siegfried Bettmann, founder of Triumph Motorcycles, built the BSA Scrambler, widely considered to be the first dirt bike. It was basically a bicycle with an engine, which was a bit more rugged than the other bicycles with engines of the time. Over the next decades, many individuals started scramblerizing their motorcycles and competing in hare scrambles until companies began building factory scramblers and eventually dirt bikes. But when did these dirt bikes become adventure motorcycles, which have become the most popular, versatile, and sought-after motorcycles of today? Well, depending on how you look at it, there are two answers, and I'll give you both in this video, as well as look at the history of adventure motorcycles over the last 45 years. So please stay tuned, and if you're enjoying the content, please consider subscribing, liking the video, and sharing it with friends. When it comes to adventure motorcycles, I get it. They are awesome as they provide excellent comfort, commanding seat position, good road performance, passable off-road performance, and the ability to ride around the world on roads of all types. I've owned a few and I'm currently riding the Yamaha Tenere 700, which is probably the most popular mid-sized adventure bike in the world. But the Tenere was not the first adventure motorcycle ever built. Or was it? Well, it's complicated, and Yamaha is involved. You see, in 1975, the company introduced the XT500, a big dual sport that changed the off-road game. This motorcycle had 32 horsepower, a 33-inch seat height, an 8.8-liter or 2.3-gallon tank, 7.6 inches of travel in the forks, 6.2 in the shocks, yes, there were two of them. It weighed 308 pounds dry and could hit 100 miles per hour, pretty respectable figures which put some of today's small adventure bikes to shame. The bike was good, and a rather lightly modified XT500 won the first two Paris-Dakar rallies, which helped sell many of them, although to a fairly niche market. Because it was capable of highway speeds and could be ridden across the country, it is considered by some to be the first adventure motorcycle. However, realistically, its small fuel tank probably relegates it to being the first big dual sport, something like the KTM 690 Enduro of today. It did, however, lead to the development in 1983 of the XT600, which was, in fact, the first Tenere. But before the first Tenere 600 came out, towards the end of the 70s, BMW Motorrad, the company's motorcycle division, was not doing well and was tasked with coming up with a new model based on parts that already existed. BMW was, at the time, known as the touring motorcycle company, and therefore the designers came up with the idea of cross-country touring. Not across the country touring, but touring across roads that were impassable to previous touring bikes. And so the mighty R80GS was born, the G standing for off-road and the S for street. The new bike was released in 1980, and heavily modified versions won 4 of the next 5 Dakar rallies. As with Yamaha, racing, and specifically the Dakar Rally, had a large part in the development of the adventure motorcycle. Now, the R80GS was nowhere near as good as the XT500 off-road. It was about 100 pounds heavier and much less dirt-focused. But with a relatively reasonable, by today's standards, weight of 409 pounds wet and almost 8 inches of suspension travel out front and more than 6.5 in the rear, it could ride the dirt a lot better than the typical BMW touring bike while also doing quite well on pavement. The first GS had a commanding 34-inch seat height, its 50 horsepower and 41 pound-feet of torque meant that it could easily keep up with traffic on the highway, even 2 up, and it had the feature BMW riders prize above any other, the almost zero maintenance shaft drive. Finally, the Boxer engine had a low center of gravity which made for more nimble handling and an easier time off-road, and the tank was a proper touring bike worthy 19.2 liters. Not huge, but good enough that you weren't stopping for fuel every 90 miles. Where the Yamaha XT500 was good off-road and well below average on pavement, especially on the highway, the R80GS was pretty good on the road and passable off-road. No dirt bike, but no one was purchasing these to ride single track. Most adventure riders spend 98% of their time on tarmac, so it made sense for BMW to cater the first GS, and every subsequent one for that matter, to this market. The bike proved popular and helped bring BMW Motorrad back from the brink of being scrapped and re-establish the brand in the eyes of the motorcycle community, especially touring riders. These are the guys who like heading out on two wheels and exploring, and so it's no wonder that this already adventure-minded crowd appreciated having a motorcycle that did not need to turn back when the tarmac ended. If you're seeking freedom, what's more free than heading off somewhere where you're unlikely to see a car all day? Other manufacturers saw the success that BMW had with the GS and of course jumped on board. Yamaha, the creators of the XT500, brought out the XT600 Tenere. And whereas the 500 might not have been a true adventure bike, the 600 certainly was. With 46 horsepower and 38 pound-feet of torque, out of its single it had plenty of power, yet weighed 360 pounds wet. And by wet I mean with its massive 28-liter tank full. It had 10 inches of travel up front, over 9 in the rear, monoshock this time, no more of this twin shock stuff, and was absolutely beautiful. You can bet that if I had been riding a motorcycle back in 1983, and I wasn't because I was 8, I would have been on this thing. In fact, if any Japanese company today produced a bike with these specs and performance, it would cause a sensation, and that company wouldn't be able to build them fast enough to meet demand. Which is why Itchy Boots got a 1987 XT600Z to ride on her next adventure. They just don't make them like they used to. My own bias shows through here, but the XT600 was head and shoulders a better motorcycle than the R80 GS. And of course, when a new trend starts and has some success, other companies jump on it and try to exploit it, which is what the other big four Japanese companies did. Kawasaki came out with the KLR 600, the daddy of the KLR 650 in 1984. Believe it or not, that thing weighed 360 pounds wet, 100 pounds less than the current KLR. The road touring-oriented Honda Transalp came out in 1987, followed a year later by the first Africa Twin, a harder-edged adventure bike. And many Euro manufacturers also followed suit. And while some of these bikes had good off-road performance capabilities on par with the top adventure bikes of today, a strange thing started happening. Several of these so-called adventure bikes came out with upright dirt bike seating positions, but wheels and tires that were decidedly street-biased. The 1993 Triumph Tiger 900 was basically a sport touring motorcycle disguised as an adventure bike and kicked off a new genre of motorcycles, the adventure street touring bike. Other bikes of this ilk followed, most notably the Ducati Multistrada, which launched in 2003 after falling off the ugly tree and hitting every branch on the way down. This trend eventually resulted in the wholly street-biased quote-unquote adventure bikes of today like the Yamaha Tracer 9 and most recently the Harley-Davidson Pan America ST. Turns out adventure bikes make excellent sport tours. Now up until the early 2000s, although popular among a certain niche crowd of motorcyclists, adventure bikes were not yet mainstream. I remember journalists always raving about this or that adventure bike and seeming surprised that they were able to perform well in a wide range of roles. But most bikers either rode cruisers, sport bikes, or dirt. Adventure bikes seemed a weird mix of roles that could be better filled by two different motorcycles. And then, towards the end of 2004, a new TV show hit the airways and completely changed our perception of motorcycling. Obi-Wan Kenobi decided to ride around the world with his more moto-experienced friend Charlie Borman. And they decided to film a show called Long Way Round. Interestingly, they originally procured a couple of KTM bikes, which at the time would have been the KTM 950 Adventures. However, apparently, fearing that their bikes would not be able to survive the journey, KTM pulled out and BMW stepped in. And man, did that turn out well for BMW, because that show was a huge hit among motorcyclists, and the BMW R1100 GS, having by now ballooned to 500 pounds, was its star. And oh, did the sales roll in. KTM must have been kicking themselves, though given their early models' reliability issues, maybe they were right about their bikes not being able to make a journey around the world. Now, it was clear to any riders with dirt experience watching that show, as well as the follow-up Long Way Down, that had these guys just gotten KLR 650s or DR 650s or any number of much lighter motorcycles, those trips would have been a lot easier. But suddenly, it seemed that every dad on every suburban block in every Western nation had to get a big GS and pimp it out with crash bars and floodlights, heated seats and grips, and all other sorts of doodads so that he could brave the elements on the way to Starbucks. And suddenly, with so many large adventure bikes selling like hotcakes, every other manufacturer had to have a GS clone to compete. I rode one of these clones, the Moto Guzzi Stelvio 1200 NTX, a supremely comfortable 600-pound behemoth which was well behaved and very capable on pavement and absolutely terrifying on dirt. Soon, Ducati reintroduced a liquid-cooled version of its Multistrada, a motorcycle that has the distinction of being the first bike with rider modes, and the floodgates opened. Some manufacturers were successful, as with Honda, which brought back the Africa Twin, and Suzuki, which sold plenty of V-Stroms in 2 different sizes. And some were not. The 2010s are strewn with the bodies of ever larger and more complex motorcycles which could not compete with the mighty GS, in part thanks to the Long Way franchise, but also owing to its trump card, the low-maintenance shaft drive. And by the end of the decade, it seemed that in their desire to build the fastest, most complex, and most technologically advanced machines imaginable, as well as the most expensive, the market had lost its way. While riders were asking for lighter, simpler, and more affordable and manageable motorcycles, they were being served up bigger and more complex spaceships, culminating in the BMW R1250 GSA, a 600-pound aircraft carrier of a motorcycle which was ridiculously large and expensive. But this is where we come full circle, because it was Yamaha of all manufacturers, the builders of the second ever adventure motorcycle, which bucked the trend and made a simpler, lighter, and less expensive option, the Tenere 700. And they sold a ton of them, including one to me. Soon enough, Aprilia jumped in with another light middleweight model, Honda brought back the Transalp, and manufacturers started to put serious R&D into developing smaller, dirt-worthy options and responding to what riders had been asking for all along. And so today, we are having a resurgence of sorts of smaller and simpler adventure motorcycles like the Royal Enfield Himalayan 450 and KTM 390 Adventure R, with new models soon to drop from Kawasaki and BMW. And additionally, we have had somewhat of a Chinese invasion with CF Moto and Kove offering very attractive bikes at even more attractive prices. To me, this looks eerily similar to the Japanese car companies coming into Western markets in the early 80s and Korean manufacturers arriving in the 90s. My guess is that in a decade we will take it for granted that Chinese motorcycles are on the scene and that Chinese manufacturers control large parts of the Western motorcycle market. Overall, I like the latest developments. I'm a fan of small, simple, reliable, and inexpensive machines that just get the job done, and this seems to be the direction the market is moving in nowadays. Even among the big bikes, the latest R1300 GS has been the first GS model to actually lose weight, so it appears that BMW finally got the message that lifting 600-pound machines off of dirt roads where they've fallen is not fun for anyone involved. So that was my very incomplete rundown of the history of the adventure motorcycle. I know I've missed plenty of significant machines, but I'm also trying to keep this video a reasonable length. If you have a favorite bike that I didn't mention, please let me know in the comments. Also, where do you see the industry heading, and what bikes would you most like to see in the future? I'm looking forward to the new Kawasaki KLE 500 that was teased at EICMA last year. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Adventure safe, check out these other videos you might find interesting, and as always, may the spokes be with you.